Everybody to our webinar today, a Caregiver Aware Canada, the Power of Many. And for the first time, we have our three nonprofit organizations dedicated 100% to supporting family and friend caregivers across the country, collaborating on this campaign, Caregiver Aware. I'm guessing that's how many of you heard about the webinar today, and we're just thrilled. I'm going to be moderating the webinar today, and just to give you an overview of what we'll be doing, we have a few slides that we're going to be showing just to kind of give you a sense of the magnitude of caregiving across the country and what that means and how we've been working so hard to increase caregiver awareness, but what can we do to expand that awareness across the nation. All three of our panelists, who I will be introducing in just a second, are executive directors of the provincial organizations that they represent. Collectively in the room, we have almost 70 years of experience. These three organizations have all been around for a long period of time, and so each one of these executive directors has a lot of experience and knowledge about the changes that have been happening across the country for the better, but we know that we still have lots to do. So we thought it would be just a great idea to have this webinar today so that we can invite and start that national conversation about what we need to do to work together. So, moving right along, I promised to introduce our three panelists. So Barb MacLean, who you can see, wave Barb. If you're joining us by computer, you will see Barb in the webcam. Barb has been the Executive Director of Family Caregivers of BC for over 15 years. And what you're going to notice about all three of these Executive Directors is all three of them have been family caregivers. That's very often what makes people aware of the magnitude of the role and the importance that it plays in our system. Barb has a Bachelor and Master's of Arts degrees and has been in the nonprofit sector for many years and knows firsthand because she was a caregiver for her mom. And I can tell you from my own personal experience working with Barb that she is a zealot about being family and friend caregiver support and the importance of that across our country. I've also had the pleasure of meeting Angus Campbell. Angus is joining us from Nova Scotia, and his organization has been around for 20 years. He as well became very familiar with being a caregiver to his late partner who became a paraplegic. And Angus switched from being someone involved in IT, finance, and project management to taking a leadership role in the nonprofit sector. And Angus, I'm sure that your province and organization is very grateful for your dedication. Sandy Sereda is joining us from Caregivers Alberta. Sandy's in the upper left-hand or right-hand corner of your screen. And Sandy as well was a caregiver to her grandmother when she was quite young. And we have a growing population of young caregivers that we're going to be talking about. So Sandy as well has a rich and varied career in the not-for-profit sector and is now the Executive Director of Caregivers Alberta, which has been serving Alberta, I think, for 20 years. So we are just thrilled, all of us, to be here with you today. And as I mentioned, we're going to go through some slides right now just to talk about the magnitude of caregiving in Canada, what that means, and then we're going to quickly go into our discussion. We have a few questions, and we're hoping that you will please join this conversation by typing into the chat box. And I'm going to make sure that your questions and comments are heard by our panelists. And I'm going to move now to the formal part of our webinar. Over to you, Angus.
People taking part in this today. I'm starting us off with a few slides, and really it's like, so why do caregivers matter? And so we're going to discuss just a few of the statistics. Just as a start. You can see here on this graphic that for every hour of paid care, a family friend caregiver provides 10 hours of unpaid care. So we know right away that if we didn't have that unpaid care, people would not be able to stay in their homes. And we have the research and the data to support that. According to the last General Social Survey, which was done in 2012, although we just had one in 2018, we don't have the report from it yet. But we know from then, from 2012, that 28% of Canadians are caregivers. And here in Nova Scotia, we have a higher amount. We have where it's normally 1 in 4 for Canada, it's 1 in 3 in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick. We have older populations, and we don't have the same people around to help out as much. So we're feeling the crunch differently here, but just as all caregivers are. We know that 70 to 80% of the care is outside of the clinical setting, so that really, for the most part, is in the home environment, and that this is amazing. 89% of care that is being given is for greater than 1 year.
Sounds good. Thanks, Angus. So conversely,
people are being able to stay at home, but we have to rely
caregivers
on the
experience as caregivers, but we also need to talk about what happens to the system.
Caregiver.
So what happens is that when we've got more, as our generation ages,
when we take a look at
older, those baby boomers are growing up into seniors. We're finding that our systems, our healthcare systems, are very challenged. And if we don't have the caregiver in the home,
40%,
then that aging in place
male and 54%
value is being
female.
Lost because more and more people are having to enter acute care or long-term care, which of course has a huge economic impact on our
women definitely
our economies, the provincial economies.
Provide a lot more personal care, whereas men will help out more.
We've noted that increased research over the past 25 years has highlighted that caregivers are experiencing more emotional, more physical, more financial and health-related
providing personal care
challenges. And also we find the same thing as care providers in the system, that oftentimes a care provider, that is somebody who's paid to provide care, is also a caregiver in the home. And therefore they're experiencing, again, increased stress rates, because they're carrying on both sides of their lives.
And Sandy, one of the things that comes to mind about that is the term double duty caregiving, and it's really showing up in the healthcare system of people taking leave and forcing the system to take a look at its employees as well. And some of the most stressed employed caregivers are those double duty caregivers, I would say. Yeah.
Absolutely. So whether it's they are employed as care providers, or whether it's they're simply employed, caregivers are finding the stress of trying to balance two parts of their lives right now. Many caregivers are actually stepping out of the labor force in order to provide care for their loved one, but that has a significant impact both on the labor force, as Angus said. The people that are stepping out of the labor force are those who are in their prime working years, that 45 to 65 age range.
And again, those might be the same people that are caught in that sandwich generation of caring for young people, whether they are able-bodied or disabled, as well as somebody that's aging and becoming frail. So in reference to Angus's note about 70 to 80% of the care happens outside of the clinical setting, another way to put that is to say that taxpayers' money is only paying for 10 to 20% of the costs outside of the clinical setting. So in other words, most of that care, sure, we're paying a certain amount to home care providers and such, but an awful lot of the care that we're seeing is that unpaid loved one. I'm going to move on to the next slide and say the reason why we're having this conversation, of course, is that caregivers need to be identified and supported. One of the things at Caregivers Alberta that we hear all the time on our caregiver advisor hotline is that, oh, I wish I had known about you sooner, which really says to us that we're not doing everything we can right now to ensure that caregivers are identified on the early part of their journey and that caregivers are supported in a timely manner. They may not want to have a whole lot of support in the early part of their journey, but as they become more challenged, we need to be available to them so that we can provide the supports as that journey continues. As organizations, healthcare professionals, bankers, lawyers, grocers, pharmacists, we all need to become caregiver aware and recognize the role of the caregiver across our communities. So how can we do that? We need to understand the value of a family caregiver's contribution to society and to the healthcare system. We need to recognize the challenges of caregiving on the family caregiver themselves and how the whole family dynamic can change. We need to demonstrate awareness of family caregivers and their role. We need to actually recognize them when they get into a hospital or a medical appointment and recognize them. And here's where I get really a little bit adamant, not just as the daughter, not just as the spouse. I have a real problem with the word just. We tend to diminish and devalue ourselves when we say, I am just the daughter, I'm just the spouse, I'm just the friend. And that then doesn't give the healthcare recipient or provider you're not valuing yourself and you're not allowing the healthcare provider to value you and include you in the conversations about health. I think we'll move on from there. So just again to say that family and friend caregivers are not necessarily self-identifying, and we need to shift the culture so that the entire culture is recognizing the value of family in caring for loved ones and recognizing the value in the role of caregiving itself. I think it's really important that we talk about how do we recognize someone. Certainly we need to recognize them in all of the areas where a caregiver is walking alongside a care recipient. And as I mentioned, that might be health appointments, it might be doing groceries, it might be running to the pharmacy. So how do we, if we're not a caregiver in this situation, how do we recognize that the caregiver is perhaps needing help? And how do we ensure that they're getting the help they need? Let's ask. BC comes up with some great, whoops, I've got all sorts of things happening here. BC has some really good language that they've presented, which is to recognize that a caregiver doesn't necessarily even understand the term caregiver yet. So let's just ask them about what they're doing. Are you looking after someone who can't manage without your help? Janet, are you helping me here?
Sorry, Sandy. I just was trying to type in the box.
Okay. And just asking, in any situation, again, whether it's the grocer or the pharmacist, are you helping somebody? Are you helping your mom? Are you helping your dad? Are you helping your friend with their appointment today or with their groceries? And recognizing them in enough to say, how are you doing in all of this journey? Not just how is the care recipient doing, but how are you doing as you look after your loved one? You would be amazed at how quickly the conversation will turn from the needs of the loved one to, this is hard work. This is really scary stuff that I'm dealing with, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. And how often just a little bit of a listening ear can make a world of difference to a caregiver. I think this is over to you, is it not, Barb?
Sure. Thanks, Sandy. When we look at the evidence, we have actually 30 years of research that shows us that, number one, caregivers need support, and that it needs to be both practical and psychosocial in nature, and that we're going to do a better job if our health system recognizes their needs and is a partner in making identification, referral, and including their voice part of how they view their jobs. We know that earlier is better. So much like that slide where we saw a graph, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, and then crash and burn, we want to get the support in earlier so that crash and burn and burnout doesn't occur, that we have a better chance that caregivers are resilient and stay healthy if they get support. But if they get support earlier in their caregiving role, it's much better. So we're working toward that. Slide, Janet. One of the things that we're doing here in BC is recognizing that if we're helping a system or an entire province identify caregivers and increase awareness, that we just simply as a small organization don't have millions of dollars in a big broad bundle to have a campaign that will reach enough people. So what we decided to do was target healthcare providers to be really specific in who we thought we would be able to influence change with. And so we created a number of tools that would help healthcare providers reach out to caregivers so that they could help identify the caregiver, because the caregiver is not doing that. They're not saying, hi, I'm a caregiver, I need support. We would like healthcare providers to be playing that role in a really big way. So this is just one example that you see in the slide, and it's a do not disturb door hanger, much like you see at a hotel, do not disturb, that really just visually represents the need for a caregiver to have some time for themselves, to achieve respite as an outcome, or small short breaks that give them relief from caregiving. And it's a cue, a visual cue, to pay attention to the caregiver. So we're distributing these to anybody who'd like them as one tool to engage the healthcare provider with the caregiver, or maybe it's a family member who hands it to another family member or friend and says, I know that you're a caregiver and what you're doing can be really hard. I want to be a part of your support network, and let's together think about ways that we can offer you some rest and so that you're not disturbed. So pretty basic, but one example of a visual tool to get the conversation going. When we look at identifying caregivers within our healthcare system, we consider it a huge win for caregivers and the system. So we know that the contribution is incredible, and Angus and Sandy, you both spoke to that they, caregivers, offer some of the best knowledge about the care recipient beyond a care recipient themselves. There is no one else who better knows the person than the caregiver. And often the system forgets to include them, to ask them, to consult with them, and to plan together. We know that the research is very clear that when patients and families contribute to decision making, the outcomes are better for the patient. So part of our goal is to educate healthcare providers that they, A, need to do it, they need to identify the caregiver, and they need to bring them in as part of the team. So with a caregiver's involvement and when they understand what needs to happen, they're going to be able to implement a care plan better. They're going to prevent medical errors. They're going to ensure that continuity of care is there because they are the continuous person in place for the care recipient.
And Saskia has pointed out that asking is difficult, and very often for women in particular. So
asking for
help.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's very true. And I think what everybody's been saying, Barb and Sandy and Angus, is that we need to work as a culture to shift and really encourage our healthcare providers to take that first step and ask. Are you a caregiver? How are you doing? That's just really important. So yeah, she says women do it all, and we can do it. With support. It's a great point.
Well, you know, on that point, when you look at the role of women, a huge percentage are working. We know that 60%. So you've got capable, knowledgeable people that are used to carrying an awful lot, and asking for help is something that we can learn more about, and we can actually change our own behavior to become comfortable with not just asking for, but accepting it when it's offered. So part of our approach to increasing awareness across Canada is to increase the self-identification of someone who is a caregiver and feeling absolutely comfortable that I can ask for help and I know where to get it. And at the same time,
help.
Yeah, and at the same time, the system becomes educated to prompt, to provide a cue that, yeah, we know that there is help and that it's okay to ask. And in fact, we really encourage you to do so. Yeah.
And one of the interesting things that we found here is that most of the services that we have, whether it's our call line or our webinars or even subscribing to our newsletter, it's still a large majority female. But we know that 47% of the caregiving population is male. And so we're starting to reach out and try to do different things, like we have a male support group. And what we're noticing is men prefer to be a little bit more anonymous. So they're not necessarily the ones that are going to come out to support groups, but they will join a webinar and they do subscribe to the newsletter. So we know you're out there, and we encourage you and everybody else who knows men who are caregiving to please encourage them to reach out for support. So now we're going into every province represented here today is doing something different, and it's very exciting to share.
We just wanted to share an example of some action around engaging healthcare providers to help identify the caregiver and do something. One of the things that we heard was the feeling of helplessness that healthcare providers tend to feel. And so when they don't know if there's anything to help a caregiver, they tend to just say, okay, next patient. But now, if they are educated to understand that they have a referral method, at least here in BC, using this method, it gives them something that they can act on. We've called this Caregiver Prescription Pad the 10-second handoff, and we created this in collaboration with physicians, and we asked them, what is the quickest, fastest thing you would do to identify a caregiver and make a referral? And this is what we came up with. Everybody is super busy, we know that. And we said, okay, if you've got 10 seconds, you can do this. So this RX pad, in short form, Caregiver Prescription Pad, is shared with healthcare providers, physicians, social workers, who else, Janet? You think about anybody who's part of the team.
Case managers, people in therapy in the community, anybody who comes into contact with a caregiver. This is a really, really easy way for them to say, you're a caregiver, you're going to need support, or you do need support. Here's an organization you can call with free services.
Yeah. So it's been really effective. As a result of doing this, we have noticed an increase in referrals, and we can track it back to the source of the referral. So that's been just one strategy of increasing awareness among healthcare professionals to really, and imagine that we often do presentations, and we'll say, it's okay to approach the caregiver, maybe put a hand on their shoulder and say, I understand what you're doing can be really hard, and it's really important what you do. They hand off the caregiver prescription, and that's the 10-second handoff. And we get the feedback that it's possible in any single healthcare setting, hospital discharge, clinics, doctor's offices.
And we, as Barb said, like we've seen our referrals increasing quite significantly from healthcare providers over the last couple of years. So it's encouraging for us to see that.
And then over to you, Angus.
When we take a look at what time in people's lives are they with the giving care, and 60% of them are employed, and 2/3 of them are in their prime employment years. So that means that they're between the ages of 45 and 64. And this is something we'll probably touch on later when we discuss how many of these people actually have to leave their work in order to give care right when they're at the prime of their careers. So I'll just move on to the next slide here. So it said earlier about 3/4 of family caregivers are helping with transportation, including attending those medical appointments. It's also, you can see that they're involved in scheduling them and coordinating them. There's much to be done in doing this. There's also, we take a look at what we call the ADLs, which are the activities of daily living, and so that's eating and bathing and dressing and mobility, etc. And we look at the IADLs, which are
Thanks, Angus. We're working at some different levels right now. Caregivers Alberta is the only organization amongst the three of us who is not government funded. So we tend to work a lot at government levels to advocate for caregivers and to help government recreate policy and strategy that will recognize caregivers. That, of course, is very important at this particular time as we've just had an election and our government has changed. So we're having a lot of conversations and I think that there's a lot of promise in where we're going. We're also working very hard to connect with people at the grassroots level, and just like Angus and Barb, to ask, are you a caregiver? Do you attend medical appointments? Do you prepare meals? Do you go grocery shopping? Just kind of catching people's attention because, as we've said before, they may not call themselves a caregiver, but they may recognize what the actions that they're doing. So we too encourage that people come to our website and see the resources that we have there, but more importantly to be able to connect with our family caregiver advisor and to be able to seek help with system navigation or emotional support, to just have a friendly, loving, listening ear. And we also have a Compass for the Caregiver workshop series, which is part education and part support group. It's an 8-week series of 2 hours a week. Other things that we are dreaming about right now and hope to have in place by the end of 2019 is similar sort of initiatives that Nova Scotia and BC have done, and that is engaging caregivers on the front line in doctors' offices, labs, dentists' offices. We hope to do that, A, with the prescription pad sort of model that Family Caregivers of BC has presented, but also to be advertising on the LCD monitors that you seem to see in virtually every medical office these days. We'll have some explanatory videos showing what a caregiver might be and then asking them to refer themselves to Caregivers Alberta.
Sandy, that's such a creative, that's a real creative solution to awareness. I wonder how many, across Canada, how many clinics, doctors' offices have monitors. Something to think about moving forward to take your idea and scale it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We'd love to see that. What's our next slide there, Janet? Okay.
Here we go. Well, we're moving into really the call to action, and the reason that we've come together as 3 organizations. And I thought maybe now I would just add that there's a whole lot of other organizations and individuals that have joined a national caregiver working group, the first working group that we've ever created, with the effort that together we're better than individually. One of the things that we know is that there's an awful lot going on across Canada, and it might not be at the same time, the same week, or even with the same language, but there is a lot going on. And we asked ourselves, what would happen if we began to collaborate on some common themes and some common messages and some common images? Would that create greater impact if we did this together rather than apart? And the answer for us was yes. And you might not know that Ontario now has a caregiver organization, and they're just getting rolling, and we look forward to the ability for Ontario to be a partner in collaboration in a greater way. But I've seen some social media coming from Caregivers Ontario, the Ontario Caregiving Organization. I've seen, if everybody knows that the hashtag Caregiver Aware 2019 is being used across Canada. So if you're on Twitter feed and Facebook, you'll just see a whole lot of conversation that's pretty energizing so far. Well, so moving on to the next slide, Janet. We think about, first of all, the 60% of the caregivers that are employed. In terms of awareness, we know that employers have a huge role to play in being partners in increasing awareness and in supporting their employed caregivers. So first of all, I thought I would do a shout out to RBC's iCare initiative. And it is an employee-led, what happened there?
Sorry, I keep forgetting.
Just went ahead, there we go. No, one more, Janet.
Oh.
Going back to RBC.
My apologies, everyone.
Right, there's some amazing work going on within RBC, and I think they are the leading employer in Canada to increase awareness and drive support to their employees. And this is one part of their employee-led initiative that draws attention to the role of caregivers that are working and juggling, and we know that can be incredibly stressful. So as an employee, you might turn down advancement, you might reduce your hours, and you might quit altogether. And that's not what employers want to have in Canada, for sure. So RBC is one great example of taking action, and they're doing some activities across Canada, and we'll be sharing and continuing to share through Caregiver Aware beyond this week in BC.
It's just
because there's a lot of momentum that's being gained.
Helping someone
Angus,
get up
I know you had something
in the morning,
to share about employed caregivers as well.
Helping them bathe. There's so much, and it usually falls to one person who's doing it all. So how does this translate financially? And this is really such an astounding number that unpaid caregivers are saving the Canadian healthcare system
in
Sandy, how about if I turn over the slides
Atlantic provinces. So that's a really big number. We also know that caregiving spans the spectrum. It's not, it can mean somebody as young as 7 all the way through to end of life. We also know that it affects all ethnicities and heritages. there's no section of the population that is not affected by caregiving. So why is that important? Because it's really hard to communicate such a big picture cultural change to everyone. Typically in an organization, we'd have a target audience of people, and we'd say, you know, our mandate is to reach those people who have heart disease, or those people who have had a stroke, if we were, say, the Heart and Stroke Foundation. But we're not. So if we were caring for those with heart and stroke, we'd know what the typical parameters are for heart and stroke patients, and we would address those people specifically. With caregiving, it's a much, much broader area of the public that we're trying to address. So in order to create public cultural change, it's a long-term process. And right now, we're just in the point of starting that. Maybe it's a drop in the bucket, but I believe it's a positive drop in the bucket that will help us to move forward. Angus?
Angus, did you have any comments on this? The panel is, what is one example of change that you would like to see? And the same question for our audience. Barb.
I found this to be tricky because you're asking me to give one example. So what I was thinking about, because today is about the power of many and awareness, I imagine
Absolutely.
that
Thanks, Barb.
continuing this initiative where we co-create our
Monday
awareness
evening,
efforts, and we
I
do
had
it
an
for the next
opportunity to meet
5 years.
with Nora Spinks.
I think that is something that I'd really like to hang on to, that this is a beginning collaborative effort, and it represents the start of something, but certainly not the end of it. So I think there's great power in us continuing a collaborative awareness campaign, that we have many other partners. I know Quebec's working on a November initiative. We have shared graphics, shared messaging, and some shared social media content. And I think that just driving this across the year and into the years ahead will be really one example. Sandy, what about you?
We've talked about the need for healthcare practitioners to recognize caregivers, but I think it's equally important that caregivers are recognized at the grassroots level, and that one friend can say to another friend, I see that you're having some problems right now looking after your mom. You've got an extra amount of stress on your plate. And just having those conversations of caring. I think that's really important. So at the grassroots level of things. And I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties right now too.
Oh dear.
So pass it back over to you.
Angus, do we have you? We're going to just come to our last slide, which is a reflection question.
You know,
what
such as care partners, or when we try to use terminology that's used in other countries like carer.
What can we do in our families, our circle of friends?
Really leaves
what about in your community,
wondering, well,
in your workplace,
who am
and
I?
in society at large? So this is that big question. And I love some of the responses that we've been getting in the chat box, you know, about ideas people have, like advertising at restaurants, and
how could they
you know,
possibly
it is a culture change and shift, and so the more all of us get creative and think about it, we're all part of Caregiver Aware. So come on, let's type in the chat box.
Often
Barb,
is auto-corrected to
what
career
do you
on computers.
Well, I'll talk about me personally, because we spend a lot of time here in our work.
Did you hear any of that?
Focusing on both the individual, the community, and the systems. We talked a lot about the system, and I even think about my own family and my own circle of friends. I don't know about you guys, but I cannot go anywhere where the topic doesn't emerge. On vacation, to the grocery store, working out. It's everywhere. It is around me 100% of the time, it seems like. And yet, people they're just kind of talking about it, but they're not really thinking about actively getting educated. They don't seem to understand that there's resources, even knowing what I do. So I think what I'm going to be doing more of, just linking people to resources and say, go and do this. Just check it out. You need to do this. Go to this link.
Emily just said, I think engaging caregivers in research and shifting towards implementation-based research is important. And I think all of the organizations here today would support that. It's just really important.
Angus, Sandy, how's the sound?
It's good. I'll just hop in for one, and I'm going to talk about the workplace. So Caregivers Nova Scotia, our board and I said a few years ago, well, how can we be a caregiving organization and not have caregiving policies ourselves? So because everybody at all 9 employees either are or have been a caregiver, so we created caregiving policies to support people if they have to take time away from work for caregiving. And if that means taking medical appointments or, we've got that set up for people. So we thought that we really needed to be an example that if we're talking to employers to say, well, this is what we've done.
Angus, that's fantastic. We've done the same thing. We work in a really flexible way here, and everybody on our team has had caregiving experience. And it matters a lot to be able to, when you need to respond to your mom, for example, and support on a Tuesday with a meeting book, someone on our team just jumps in so you can go into that medical appointment, for example. Sandy?
I think that absolutely, we as our own small organizations need to provide leadership there, but we also need to be encouraging other corporations to do that, recognizing that it's the first choice that caregivers often make is to reduce their hours or to step out of the employed workforce, whereas there might be other opportunities that corporations can offer, which would be flexible hours and allowing personal health sick hours to be well-being hours that can be used for family members. Those sort of things. We all need to be encouraging employers to have a broader perspective of how to best support their employees.
And I'm seeing a comment by Ben, the workplace responsibility plays
the Caregiver Aware campaign. And we encourage all of you to become Caregiver Aware zealots along with us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.